So we're moving on to lesson 2 for unit 4, which is all about feeding the cells that we have. And this lesson of the digestive system, well, we're going to see how the digestive system plays a role in getting your cells the nutrients that it needs. So there's going to be 4 different goals we're going to accomplish with this lesson. You can see them on the bottom left there. The first one is to tell the difference between a polymer and a monomer. And then the next thing, once we know that, explain why polymers break down into monomers during the digestive process. And then explain how the villi in our small intestine, they're going to get those nutrients, those monomers, to our cells. And then I want you to be able to label the parts of a digestive system on a diagram as well. Let's get started. Before we get started, we should review cellular respiration again, because this was kind of earlier in the year. You might remember cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria. The mitochondria is kind of like the power plant of the cell. We get glucose and oxygen going to the mitochondria, and those are the materials needed for cellular respiration. Through that process, your mitochondria turns this into these products. The most important one is the energy, or the ATP, if you remember that. We use ATP to create energy for our muscles, for our heart, for our brain. It's really what keeps you alive and keeps things moving in all of your cells. The other waste products that come out are water vapor and carbon dioxide. But just understanding that we use a monomer, actually glucose, something from our food, to power the cellular respiration that happens in each of our cells. At this time, we're going to be watching this video, this music video about digestion. You'll have a link on your daily agenda that you can click on this. While you're watching this video, I'd like you to be on your notes so you can kind of follow along with the lyrics on your note sheets. That'll make a lot more sense to you as you do that as well. So at this time, please pause the video and watch this music video. Okay, thank you for pausing. We're going to continue with our lesson now that you have that video in your background. It'll really help you understand the rest of the lesson. All right, you've probably heard the video say that you are what you eat, and that's probably an expression you've heard quite often. Is that really true though? I mean, if you look at this drawing, it's not really meaning that you're made of the pizza that you eat, or you can see the pizza that you eat and actually becomes you, or the vegetables that you eat. But it actually technically is true that you are what you eat. All the things that you eat and things that you drink get broken down into tiny little pieces which are used to build you again. And let me just give you some examples of that. So if you have some kind of protein, for example, like some meat, meats are made of proteins. During the digestive process, proteins get broken down into these amino acids, which are used to rebuild proteins that your cells make in the ribosomes. So those amino acids are the building blocks of making you. When we eat an apple, for an example, an apple is filled with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are broken down into even smaller pieces like glucose, which get into your cells and your mitochondria to build ATP, but they're also used to kind of build different structural components in us as well. Another example would be fat production. So fat is actually made up of glycerol, fatty acids like lipids and things like that. And when those get broken down and taken to your cells, they're actually used to build up your cell membranes, but also used as kind of storage for energy for later. So it is true, technically you are what you eat. It's not exactly looking the same as what you ate, but it gets rebuilt into you. Let's talk about polymers and monomers. So before we do that, let's talk about the 2 different types of digestion, because that's important. The first type of digestion is listed here in the song lyrics. You saw is mechanical, and that's kind of what you're seeing with the chewing here. Mechanical digestion is any kind of physical process of breaking your food into smaller pieces. Believe it or not, that doesn't just happen in your mouth with your teeth. We're going to see a few examples of that later happening throughout the process. The important one when we're talking about polymers and monomers, though, is chemical digestion. That's where your enzymes, like this would be an example of an enzyme in your system. These enzymes actually break down larger pieces like protein and carbohydrates, and here's an example of that, like a larger molecule into smaller molecules. The larger molecules are called polymers. poly is actually a root word for many. Mono is actually a root word for one. So you're basically breaking these molecules with many things into these tiny little molecules with just one thing or smaller things. That's chemical digestion. This would be an enzyme in your mouth, even in your saliva, that does that. But there's a lot of other enzymes happening in your stomach and intestines that can break down these polymers, these large molecules, into small molecules. Just to kind of give you some ideas of what polymers are. So protein, we saw that before, that's a polymer, that's a larger molecule. Nucleic acids, lipids, carbohydrates, these are other types of polymers that are out there, these larger molecules. Monomers then, actually the same ones, so proteins break down into amino acids. I believe this was carbohydrate, or this is fatty acids. Nucleic acids turn into nucleotides. And then this was probably carbohydrates. They break down into sugars like glucose. So these would be monomers. So the reason, and this is actually a question in your notes, why do polymers need to be broken down into monomers? These polymers that we were looking at before, they can't fit into your cells. There's no way they can make it in there. So the only way that we can get things into our cells is if our digestive system breaks down the polymers into these tinier molecules that can get into your cell membrane and get into the cell, because your cell needs these things to operate. So that's what makes the digestive process so important. Otherwise, our cells wouldn't be fed. I'm just going to take you kind of from place to place now in your digestive system, and you can kind of see what the process is throughout the digestive process. So for the question for this one is, what monomer do carbohydrates get broken down into? That actually does happen in the mouth here. So not only do you have the chewing and the mechanical digestion, you do have these salivary glands in your mouth as well that produce these enzymes. One of them is amylase. Amylase chemically takes starch, a carbohydrate, and breaks it down. So here would be a carbohydrate that you see. It gets broken down into glucose. So that's done by your salivary glands during this process. Moving on to the stomach. So there's actually, like I said, mechanical digestion happening in your stomach. And that's what's actually being shown on this diagram here. Your stomach bounces your food around quite a bit, and what's going to happen then is your food will break down into smaller pieces. And that allows the chemical digestion to happen even more, because you do have, as the song says, enzyme attack. You have a lot of acidic acid in your stomach that also breaks down your food even more. So these are some enzymes that break things down. Proteins get broken down during this time, and that's what your question is on your notes here. What monomer do proteins get broken down to? So here would be an example of pepsinogen, an enzyme breaking down these polymers into monomers. So here would be protein, and then protein breaks down into amino acids. So amino acids are like the building blocks for protein. We actually saw this in reverse when your cells use amino acids to build proteins, like big long protein chains. This is just kind of happening in reverse in your digestive system, where big proteins get broken down into amino acids, so those tiny amino acids could fit into your cells. So moving on into like the small intestine, and also in your stomach too, there are other enzymes that break down the polymer of fat. So fats get broken down into fatty acids and glycerol and lipids. These are things that build up fats, and then they get broken down into these smaller monomers during digestion in the small intestine, but also in the stomach as well. So that's the enzyme that gets broken down there. On this same slide then, let's talk about how the small intestine, like the villi and these other organisms produce these monomers and move our monomers around. So inside your small intestine, we have these things called villi. These villi, as you notice, are everywhere. They're very small, and they're littered all throughout your small intestine. What that does is it increases your surface area of your small intestine to an astronomical amount, and then it can do a lot of absorbing of these monomers. This would be an example of, see, these monomers kind of getting absorbed into your small intestine, and you notice that in these villi we actually have blood vessels that pick up these monomers that are getting absorbed by the villi. So yeah, you see this, all these capillaries are inside each villi picking up all these monomers and putting them into your bloodstream. And here's a kind of a close-up view of that. This would maybe be the glucose molecule, I think, going into your bloodstream from all the villi. Here's kind of a diagram of that happening too. So these would be veins, those would be capillaries. The food, the monomers get kind of into your villi, and then now they're into your bloodstream. When it's in your bloodstream, then it can be taken to your cells, right? So here's an example of that. So let's say these are all your cells. Here are some capillaries. So then it kind of gets transferred from your cell, from your bloodstream to your cell. You also notice that things like carbon dioxide are going back into your bloodstream to be taken out of your body. So this is where this great exchange happens in your capillaries, in your blood vessels, to your cells. So these monomers were picked up by your villi in your intestines to your blood vessels, now getting passed to your cells to give them what they need. This last slide is to help you kind of label and diagram the parts of the digestive tract. So I'd like you to make this also in your notes so that you can show me that you were able to get this done too. That's all for our lesson. So if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me during my office hours. We'll talk about the next steps moving forward.